Oh dear, I don't know how I'm going to compete with the lunch, but I shall try to keep my mind on where I'm trying to go rather than on the food that's in the table before me. I guess the guy following in the footsteps of David Tacey and Father Bob, um, I'm completely in accord with the sentiments that they have stressed. But I guess I would take a slightly different approach, largely because I'm a geologist and I'm not an archaeologist, and I come from a different background. And it's from that background that I speak to you today. It's one in which my conviction, after working for years in Central Australia, working on the problem of climate change, which took me to the dry lakes of Western New South Wales. The story of climate change and the story of the Australian landscape was what excited me in my in my early days of graduating from Melbourne University. The I suppose the simple story that I'd try to get across to you is bearing on and fully in mind the story that the approach that David has taken in the amazing story of Indigenous Australia. My conviction is that until we can combine those powerful elements of land and people in Australia, it's the combination of land and people which really unites, provides that genesis of new power in which I think is embedded the nature of the spirit. The combination of land and people. Now, it began, I suppose, we go my Irish ancestry. My father I was a fisherman in the west coast of Ireland, so I'm the first stage of the boat people, or he was. And looking around this room, we're very fortunate to have very important representations of the Indigenous community, but we're 90% pale faces or a few overseas people. We're all foreigners to this land, except our Indigenous cousins. We're all foreigners. And in those days, and I said 1788, or when the first fleet arrived, like my ancestors, they brought with them the leftover, the remnants. They brought the wounds of the Enlightenment. They brought the scars of what we might call now the great advantages of science and the rational analysis of the world. Great advantages on one hand, but at great cost on another. The great cost was the loss of the sense of the intuitive and the sense of spirit in those early days of religious conviction in Europe. The growth of science, the materialistic attitude to the world as a machine, in conjunction with the demise of a lot of outdated and preposterous religious pomposity, carried with it. It was like the baby was thrown out with some of the bathwater. With the rise of rationalism and the rise of the mechanical view of the world, the rise of the market economy, and the rise that power is invested in the market economy, that provided the basis for the arrival in Australia and the misunderstanding of those early arrivals with both land and people. Great misunderstanding. Our early European arrivals were not equipped, were not ready to encounter either the land nor the people. So we were faced then, as we still face today, with these two major cultural differences: the difference of rationalism on one hand and intuitive understanding of nature and the spirit on the other. They are incompatible, oil and water. One has destroyed the other. So that in that context, I feel that our ancestors, white Australia, is still grievously wounded and is still recovering from the effects of the Enlightenment. Now, that causes me a lot of trouble with my scientific colleagues who see the Enlightenment as the great revolution in science and the great way forward. Yes, it is. Great innovations in health and education, but at a cost. And that cost was the loss of the sense of the intuitive. And we find that sense really preserved in the Indigenous people of Australia today, And it comes at a great pain to really understand the implications of that connection. So today I'm going to my thesis is really one of trying to identify that to which we are connected. It is our connections that largely make us who we are. So it's in that context that I'd like to explore with you the nature of those connections. My own, it's a personal journey as a geologist and out there in the sand dunes, trying to understand the way the climate has changed, the way the Australian landscape reflects those global changes in the past. And it's interesting as we sit here in Brighton, if we turn the clock back 20,000 years, during the maximum of the last glaciation, we are sitting in a desert. Those of you who play golf and know the sand dune country down Mornington, those dunes are desert sand dunes. The sand dunes were blowing across Melbourne, down towards Tasmania. They blew across Bass Strait into the northwestern coast of Tasmania. We are living in a land with tremendous memory of the past, of memory of climate change, into which Australians arrived some 60, 70, 80, maybe more thousand years ago. So it's in that context that we have to bring together the conjunction of the land and the people. And we of European ancestry came along quite ill prepared to meet that conjunction. And we're struggling with it today. So this opportunity is one in which we can share together some of the details that I have encountered and which have fortunately put me in a situation, often unfortunately, of being responsible for quite significant changes in Australian history. My journey into the dry lakes of Western New South Wales was in search of using the dry lakes in search of the past presence of water. Dry lakes today, but there was sufficient evidence that there had to be water there in the past for their formation. And it was in the process of mapping dry lakes in Western New South Wales that I found myself walking along what were clearly ancient beaches, gravels and beach sands, sitting quite high up in the landscape. There was clearly a major change in the environment. But in that process, I found myself walking also alongside fresh, not fresh, but ancient shells, mussel shells, lying up on the sand dunes. Shells where they shouldn't have been, and then traces of fish remains up on sand dunes and stone tools. So I immediately realised that I was walking in the footsteps of people who were there in the past. That I was a recent arrival. There were people there many thousands of years before me. I knew from the geology of the dunes that those stones and the shells were deposited many thousands of years ago. So I took this story back to my archaeological colleagues in Canberra, and they said, "No, Bowler, there was nobody here 20,000 years ago. No way. The people weren't here 20,000 years ago. You're a geologist. You stick to your stones. Leave us the archaeology." So it was only a year or two later that I found the burnt bones high up on a dune. They were large mammal bones, clearly evidence of human burning. I brought my archaeological colleagues out, and then a moment of great discovery, they lifted up the bones, and out fell a piece of human cranium. These were the bones, we now know, of ancient Mungo Lady. They were cremated bones, the age of which we've now established. Initially we thought at 24,000, but now back to 40,000 years. Cremated bones of a young woman. It was only a few years later then that in the shoreline dunes, only 400 metres from the location of Mungo Lady, that the tip of a cranium was appearing at the surface. And that then immediately, in my colleagues arrived in haste a day or two later, brushed back the sand and revealed the remarkable remains of now known as Mungo Man. And on the notes that have been passing around, some of you don't have them, there's a photograph of Mungo Man, and that is largely the centrepiece of my story. Mungo Man dated then to 40,000 years, same age as Mungo Lady. Now, the critical element here is in the nature of those burials. Immediately, it became apparent that we were facing the reality of Australians in this landscape long, long before we had imagined. Additionally, the sophisticated nature of their burials was such that these people were highly sophisticated, fully modern and highly sophisticated culturally. The story of Mungo Man's burial is itself a story of its own right. That burial, carefully laid out, fully articulated, with his hands joined by the groin, and in scraping away the sand. I should stress that the Aboriginal people have often been worried that we excavated. I wasn't looking for people. These bones, as Auntie Mary Pappen, the Indigenous lady Mutti Mutti, often says, these people came back to the surface. They appeared by natural erosion. That was the only way I could see them, by natural erosion. They were then removed by archaeological colleagues, but Mary Pappen, the Mutti Mutti people say, these people came back to tell us their story. And so I was privileged to have the responsibility for making the next moves. And my burden today is to ensure that Mungo Man's remains, who still reside in the National Museum in Canberra after being removed from the Australian National University in November last year, they still reside. After 42 years, they are still waiting to come home. Now, those bones, the story of those bones is absolutely incredible. In scraping away the sand from around the bones, my colleague Alan Thorne, the physical anthropologist, said, "Hey, what's this?" And he passed me a little sort of pellet of something. And in my hand, it was a pellet of limonite, a pellet of strong red ironstone. It was a pellet of ochre. And ochre, the hematite, the mineral hematite, is they're not known in that part of Western New South Wales. The nearest ochre would be 200 kilometres away. And scraping away the sand, it then became clear that that body had been anointed in ochre from the top, from the cranium down to the groin. That body had been either sprinkled or painted by ochre. The ochre had to be traded or brought in from a long distance. Now put yourselves back into the story of that community. 40,000 years ago, an old man, we don't know his actual age, he was fully mature, probably 50 years, died. A man of stature in the community. The word went out for the great burial. The ceremony was enacted on the shores of that lake. And it was a ceremony of such ritual that it would qualify for any requiem celebration in a cathedral in our land today. Celebrated there in the cathedral shores of the lake. There, that community of people reflecting that extremely high level of sophistication. This was 40,000 years. This is art. This is creative, cultural, and expression of art, and an expression of spirit. You don't paint a body in that sort of reverence for burial as implications, but for much beyond the material body. The implications of a life, something after, but something beyond. And in that burial, Mungo Man was identifying not only his connections with ochre, but connections with the landscape, connections with the whole environment. Those people and that burial represents a connected culture to the land, connected to the cosmos. They were living under the stars. They were living in the full drama of nature and aware of that nature and incorporating into their culture. That presents to us the first dynamic connection between culture and nature, a dynamic connection which we seek to restore today. It's a connection which then dramatically lives on, as David Tacey has outlined earlier, in the lives of Indigenous people today. What is it that differentiates us from Indigenous people? It's the way they are connected. They are connected to country. And it's quite clear now that when the level of that, the meaning of that connection is such that it's a psychological one, it's a psychic power. An Aboriginal person in his own country is empowered by that presence. Take them away out of that country, and without being able to continue that connectivity, there are huge psychological problems. We see it around us in the marginalisation of Aboriginal communities. And our culture has, of course, been responsible for that marginalisation. But the reality of that connection, a dynamic one. And it's that connection. When we look back at our own spirituality, it's been, I would suggest, we have lost those connections. We have lost them partly through the power of science. Science can explain the world. We don't need God. We don't need the spirit to understand the dynamics of atomic science. But that connection has also been severed by distortion in Christian religion, the fundamental Christianity. It makes a lot of nonsense now in the reality of science. The Genesis, I think it's fair to say that every person has deep inside us the desire for some sort of Genesis. It's endemic. People continue to ask who we are, where do we come from? Now, we now see, in the case of the Aboriginal people, our cousins in this land, they have a connection that we've lost. And that connection in Mungo Man and Mungo Lady was a connection between nature and culture. In that burial, they brought together the reality of the world around them. It was a physical reality with ochre, and that was connected to their culture. And it's that connection between nature and culture which strikes me today as being that power, the enabling power of spirit connection. Because when we bring together that dynamic of nature and culture, a new energy is born. And it's the energy of empathy, the energy of spirit, of the energy of identifying with the land and identifying with the people. Now, in this case of Mungo Man and Mungo Lady, I believe now we have an opportunity to restore, or to look at the example that the Aboriginal community have provided us. Now, as David Tacey says, we cannot appropriate it. Theirs is their own natural heritage. Ours is different. Ours, as Peter pointed significantly earlier today, to the Big Bang. We now have an extraordinary understanding of nature, the world we live in, and the world from which we all came. We look around this room, a dynamic of consciousness, of active minds interacting. Wind the clock back 200,000 years ago, there was no art. Wind the clock back another 200,000 years ago, there were no people. Go back 5 or 6 million years ago, and we were chimpanzees. We were still up the trees. The incredible power is that consciousness has come from rocks, come from the Big Bang. Now, trying to assimilate the meaning of that in the Australian context brings us back to Earth. This land and this continent has an amazing history, geological history. 60,000 million years ago, we were in Antarctica. In the rocks beneath us, just out the road a bit, there are dinosaurs that grew in Antarctica. This is the land we live on. The land then, as it were, was nurtured or preserved for the arrival of consciousness, for the appearance of the first sign of creative art. How do you measure the first peoples? All we can say now is that the first modern people arrived in Africa 200,000 years ago. 200,000 years ago, none of us were around. No art. The first human arrivals in Australia, we don't know. We probably never will know. But they were certainly here. Mungo Man, 40, stones below him, 50,000, probably 60, 70,000 years. These new people arrived. Then, 250 years ago, along comes this other mob of us and superimposes our misunderstanding on both people and land. This is our challenge, to restore that balance that between nature and culture, between people and land. The Aboriginal people provide us with the example. It's up to us now to work with it. So in my conclusion then, I would just like to say that Mungo Man has to come home. He has to come back to his land and the shores of Lake Mungo. The Aboriginal people, they've been struggling. They've had a lot of problems knowing what to do with these bones. The government of New South Wales and the Commonwealth have absolutely neglected their responsibility. 42 years after his emergence, there's still nowhere to put him. I don't want to go into the story of mismanagement. That's not what we're here to discuss. But Mungo Man will come home next year. The Aboriginal people have made that decision. By hook or bloody crook, he's coming back. They will find somewhere to put him. At the moment, there will be no grand building there. There will be no edifice. Even to get a crypt, even to get some appropriate place, not only for him now, but there are remains of at least 80 to 90 other people who have emerged from the Mungo sands, bones washing out on the surface. What do you do with them? We have brought back, we gave great tribute to the Australian people who died in the Somme. We bring their remains back home to Australia. Meanwhile, for the people who died 40,000 years ago, still no respect, still no comparable respect and their significance is so empowers us today to make a new attempt to identify on the ground that recognition that we now see with the Indigenous people. They have something that we have lost. We owe them a debt for demonstrating to us, for reminding us what we have lost. And I would suggest that the return of Mungo Man is an occasion in which, as a nation, we acknowledge that debt. We return to the Aboriginal people the sense of dignity from which they have been so drastically deprived. There's a moment coming next year. We don't know where it is. It's not been arranged yet. There's a moment, however, in which I believe the nation, there's a moment in which Malcolm Turnbull, he needs an occasion where he can say something of a statesman-like manner, of which we hope he would be capable. When he could come out and say, we acknowledge back, we're giving something back to Indigenous Australia. We are now in a condition, we acknowledge what we have done, and in a spiritual sense, this is, as it were, an act of contrition. We have to say not only sorry for what we have done, but now we have to stand up and make a statement to the rest of the world that white Australia acknowledges that we have so much to learn from our Indigenous cousins. We acknowledge that to them. We hand back to them the dignity with the return of Mungo Man. Now, at the moment, there is still nowhere to put him. There's still nowhere to celebrate that great moment. And that's occasion in which I've spoken to Ben, our colleague John Mulvaney, who really was the pioneer of the World Heritage Area, died 3 weeks ago. Time is passing on. I'll be passing on very shortly, and Mungo Man's still not home. So to Ben and his people here today, their friends here today, we are all partners in this. This is a big journey. It affects all of us. I'm just one player in the game. Mungo Man is another, a central icon. How many icons do we have in Australia? Who are they? Ned Kelly, Phar Lap, how many others? Mungo Man stands in that national national status as a representative, a cross-cultural representative, and for me, the centre which reminds us of the links between nature and culture, the connection to which we are all now challenged to address. It is one in which the energy of love is born. Love for land, love for people, and I think that's partly the issue we're here today.
Well, Dad, that's beautiful and profound, and a very special moment. I think everyone in the room, acknowledges your depth of carrying this story and the wisdom in that, and the beauty and the opportunity that exists in that. And that's certainly something I think that's very moving for all of us. And then looking towards this opportunity next year, and I think one of the things we really want to make in echoing Dad's sentiment is that we can all, and I'm sure everybody in this room at different times can feel that in the political climate there's a real kind of bit of a spiritual wasteland. We also need to acknowledge that the political climate is following and echoing culture. And so who is responsible for culture? And that's really the question we want to ask today. Is it the politicians? Is it the bureaucrats? Who's responsible for the culture? Who's responsible for making sure that Mungo Man, when he goes back in the ground, happens in a dignified way, as is deserved? Not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's something that can carry us forward. Cross-cultural icon. I love that. I've spoken to Indigenous people around the world over the last 6 months in particular, as we're getting ready to do Uday Festival in Ethiopia. And I've told them about Mungo Man, and all of them resonate deeply. This is not just an Australian thing. This is a cosmic moment, and there's an opportunity. And right now it's been held up in bureaucratic circles, and that's not okay. So I think, once again, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Dad. Put your hands together, please, guys, for this. There's a lot of emotion. But as I say, where there's life, there's hope. Where there's life, there's hope. And there's life in the room.